Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're setting out to demystify one of history's most provocative, influential, and honestly, most misunderstood thinkers. We're talking about a man positioned right at the forefront of a massive shift in Western history. He predicted the absolute collapse of our cultural foundations and offered these grandiose, revolutionary ideas as a solution. That's right, we're talking about Friedrich Nietzsche. My goal for us today is to guide you through his actual philosophy, strip away all the myths, and show you how his work is actually a profound guide to becoming who you really are. So let's dive right in. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Take a second and just let that sink in. You've almost certainly heard this phrase, right? It literally echoes through our modern culture every single day. And, well, because of bold statements exactly like this, Nietzsche has developed this incredibly aggressive, almost fearsome reputation. He's often pictured as the ultimate philosophical hardliner. But you know what's truly fascinating? It's how sharply that fierce, edgy reputation contrasts with his actual, lived reality. His life journey was intensely volatile. I mean, he showed such extraordinary intellectual promise right out of the gate that at just 24 years old, he became the youngest professor of classical philology to ever be hired at the University of Basel. It's an incredible achievement. Yet, this rapid rise, it was mirrored by an equally dramatic fall. By age 44, he suffered a devastating mental breakdown, completely losing his sanity. He actually spent the last 11 years of his life in a catatonic state before a tragic death at age 55. Part 1. The Misunderstood Philosopher. To really wrap our heads around his philosophy, we have to look past the edgy stereotypes, the aggressive quotes, and yes, that very famous, very large mustache. We need to look at the man himself with a bit of empathy. You see, his life was absolutely not a triumphant march of dominance. He was born in 1844 in a quiet village where his father was a Lutheran pastor. Tragically, his father suffered horribly and died of a terminal brain disease when Nietzsche was very young. Later, while studying theology, Nietzsche was exposed to critiques that caused him to completely lose his Christian faith. And physically, his adult life was plagued by agonizing chronic illnesses, including what is widely believed to be syphilis. He was chronically rejected by women, and he lived this incredibly lonely, isolated life in the Swiss Alps, basically scraping by on a small pension. And as for his writing during his lifetime, his books just didn't sell. He garnered almost no respect or recognition. It's a profound irony, really. Here is a man who wrote of grand heroism and ultimate power, all while barely surviving his own miserable circumstances. Part 2. The Death of God and the Threat of Nihilism. It was from this place of deep isolation and suffering that Nietzsche diagnosed the most monumental cultural shift of the 19th century. He was looking out at a society reeling from mass democracy and atheism, and he saw a massive, empty crater opening up right beneath Western civilization. Which brings us to his most famous and probably most misinterpreted declaration, "God is dead and we have killed him." Now, people so often read this as a celebration, like a victory lap for atheism, but it is entirely the opposite. Nietzsche is actually delivering a dire warning here. He's terrified of what this means. While he personally believed religious beliefs were false, he observed that they were incredibly beneficial. They helped us cope with the immense, heavy problems of life. The absolutely crucial point he's making is this. The collapse of the Christian faith brought with it the collapse of the whole of European morality. Without this foundation, he feared humanity would be left to struggle without any clear system of meaning. We would just devolve into widespread despair and nihilism. Nietzsche recognized that, in his view, there is no universal, objective, capital T, truth to be found anymore. And without that objective truth handed down from above, well, humanity is suddenly forced to forge a completely new path. We literally have to create our own subjective meaning from the ground up. Part 3. Envy, Alcohol, and Morality. So how exactly do we build meaning in a world without it? Nietzsche wasn't just diagnosing the problem, he actually wanted to offer real solutions to this newly emerging void. He was writing what amounts to a highly practical, therapeutic guide to life. He developed what we can summarize as 4 clear directives for a fulfilled life. 1. Own up to your envy. 2. Reject what he called slave morality. 3. Never drink alcohol. And 4. Replace scripture with culture. Let me walk you through these, because even though this is abstract 19th century philosophy, it's actually a remarkably actionable guide for your daily life right now. Let's start with envy. Traditionally, Christianity taught us to be ashamed of our envious feelings, seeing them as an indication of evil. But Nietzsche? He completely flips this on its head. To him, envy is not a sin. It's actually a vital indicator of what you truly desire. Think about it. Every single person who makes you envious, whether it's a wildly successful writer, a wealthy tycoon, or a master chef, is actually hinting at who you are capable of one day becoming. So, his advice? Stop hiding your envy. Face up to your true desires and put up a heroic fight to actually honor them. This leads us directly to his second point, rejecting what he called Sklavenmoral, or slave morality. Nietzsche argued that Christianity had emerged back in the late Roman Empire among timid, weak individuals. People who, in his view, simply lacked the stomach to get what they actually wanted out of life. Things like power, sex, mastery, and creativity. So instead of fighting for these things, he believed they created a hypocritical value system, one that made a virtue out of their very own cowardice. He believed this slave morality was essentially a giant machine for bitter denial. It relies entirely on a hypocritical rebranding. As you can see, you take your actual motivation, weakness, and you completely rebrand it as goodness. You take sexlessness and you call it purity. You take your inability to take revenge on someone you hate and you spin it into forgiveness. He argued that the masses, or the herd as he called them, use this system to denounce what they secretly desire simply because they are too inept to go out and get it. And this brings us to his third, very practical rule: avoid alcohol. Now, Nietzsche famously declared that there have been two great narcotics in European civilization: Christianity and alcohol. He hated alcohol for the exact same reason he scorned slave morality. Both of them, he argued, just numb our pain. Both of them offer this fleeting, transient feeling of satisfaction that reassures us things are just fine as they are, but in doing so, they completely sap our will to actually change our lives for the better. To avoid numbing the pain that he felt was absolutely necessary for personal growth, Nietzsche himself drank only water. Well, water and, as a special treat, a glass of milk. Part 4. The Will to Power and the Übermensch. So, if we strip away religion and we strip away the numbing effects of alcohol and false morality, what exactly are we left with? How do we fill the gap? Well, Nietzsche believed we must turn to culture, things like philosophy, art, music, literature, but not as dry academic exercises. He meant using them as practical guides to life. And through this, he introduces his grandest prescription for a meaningful existence. He proposed that the world operates off what he called the will to power. Now, when Nietzsche talks about power here, he is absolutely not referring to physical strength or physical dominance over your neighbor. Not at all. He means psychological and spiritual strength. It is the insatiable desire for self-mastery. True power is internal. It's this continuous, lifelong cycle of self-dissatisfaction, self-improvement, and self-rediscovery. And the ultimate embodiment of this will to power, that is the Übermensch, often translated as the Overman or Superman. This is a defiant, supremely confident individual who pursues their personal desires with absolute vigor. They embrace what he called Self-Überwindung, which means self-overcoming. Now, the Übermensch really functions as an idealized version of yourself. It's kind of like an unattainable North Star for your personal development. But the pursuit of it, that is the whole point. You must symbolically die throughout your life, constantly shedding your old, weaker self to eventually become who you really are. This idea radically changes how we view our own pain, and it brilliantly illustrates the contrast with his predecessor, Arthur Schopenhauer. See, Schopenhauer believed that life suffering is a terrible curse, and the ultimate goal of life is to minimize and avoid it at all costs. But Nietzsche? He completely disagreed. For Nietzsche, suffering is not a matter of if, but for what. Suffering absolutely must be leaned into. It has to be embraced and used as fuel for amassing that psychological power we talked about. To him, it is the meaninglessness of suffering, not the suffering itself, that is the real curse on mankind. If you have your own why in life, you can get along with almost any how. But this requires immense courage. As Nietzsche so powerfully wrote, the secret of a fulfilled life is live dangerously. Build your cities on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. You have to take risks. You must lean into the inevitable pains of life if you ever hope to transmute your suffering into something worthwhile and personally redeemable. Part 5. A tragic, ironic end. Yet for a man who philosophized so intensely about supreme psychological strength, self-mastery, and the brave embrace of suffering, his own life story brings us to a devastating, deeply ironic conclusion. In 1889, at just 44 years old, while living in Turin, Italy, his mind finally broke. The story goes that a mentally exhausted Nietzsche was walking in the street when he witnessed a carriage driver brutally beating a horse. The prophet of power, the very man who rallied so hard against weakness and the Christian values of pity, rushed over to the animal in tears. He threw his arms around the horse's neck to protect it, completely collapsing under the weight of pure compassion and pity. Hugging the horse, he wept and yelled out, "I understand you, I understand you." These were his final moments of apparent lucidity. Immediately following this visceral, heart-wrenching event, one of the most powerful minds of modern history completely collapsed into madness and catatonia, never to recover before his death in 1900. It truly leaves us to wonder if his life and death were the ultimate act of self-overcoming, sacrificing his own health and sanity for something much greater. Nietzsche doesn't force us to agree with everything he said. His open-ended philosophy leaves us the space to pave a completely new direction for ourselves. He merely asks us to look at the crater left by the loss of absolute certainties and decide what we will build in its place. So I leave you with this thought. If the pursuit of greatness truly requires us to embrace our deepest suffering, what meaning will you forge from yours?